I stared at the mahogany conference table in disbelief as Attorney Whitman finished reading my grandmother Helena's will. The prestigious downtown Chicago law office felt suffocating as my parents exchanged satisfied glances across from me. My older brother Jake smirked while adjusting his expensive suit, and his wife Tiffany barely contained her laughter behind manicured fingers. When my portion was announced, "To my granddaughter Margot, I leave the sum of $1. The room erupted in cruel amusement. My face burned with humiliation as their mockery filled the space where my grandmother's memory should have been honored. The laughter still echoed in my ears as I pushed back my chair, ready to escape this nightmare. My hands trembled as I reached for my purse, wanting nothing more than to disappear from this room where I'd been reduced to a cruel joke. But just as I stood, Attorney Whitman cleared his throat with deliberate authority. "Actually," he said, his voice cutting through the lingering chuckles, "there's a private letter specifically for Margot that must be read separately." The change in atmosphere was immediate and electric. My father, David's satisfied expression vanished, replaced by sharp concern. My mother, Susan, leaned forward aggressively, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the office windows. "What kind of letter?" she demanded, her voice carrying the same controlling tone I'd heard throughout my childhood. "We're the immediate family. We have a right to know what Helena wrote." Attorney Whitman adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, maintaining his professional composure despite the sudden tension. "Mrs. Richardson, your mother-in-law's instructions were explicit. This communication is for Margot's eyes only. No exceptions." Jake stood abruptly, his 6-foot frame imposing as he moved closer to the attorney's desk. His law degree from Northwestern had always been his weapon of choice in family disputes, and I could see him preparing to use it now. "That's highly irregular," he stated using his courtroom voice. "As the executor of our grandmother's estate, I should be privy to all documentation. This secrecy violates standard probate procedures." "Your grandmother appointed me as executor, not you," Whitman replied calmly, pulling a sealed envelope from his briefcase. "And her mental competency was thoroughly documented by 3 independent physicians in the months before her passing. Every legal requirement has been met." Tiffany's manicured nails drummed against the table surface, creating a sharp staccato rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. Her real estate empire had made her accustomed to getting her way, and I could see frustration building in her angular features. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "What could Helena possibly have to say to Margot that she couldn't say to the rest of us they barely spoke in the last few years?" The comment stung because it held truth. My relationship with grandmother Helena had grown distant after countless family gatherings where money and status dominated every conversation. I'd watch my parents and Jake systematically isolate her from anyone who didn't contribute to their financial schemes. My attempts to maintain a genuine connection had been mocked as naive sentiment. Perhaps Whitman suggested the rest of you could wait in the reception area while Margot reads her grandmother's words. "Absolutely not." My mother snapped her wedding rings, clicking against the table as she gripped its edge. "We're not leaving her alone with whatever manipulation Helena cooked up in her final days." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Even in death, they were determined to paint my grandmother as the villain while protecting their own interests. I found my voice for the first time since entering this office. "She wasn't manipulative," I said, quietly surprised by my own boldness. "She was the only person in this family who ever cared about anything besides money." Jake laughed harshly, the sound lacking any warmth. "Saint Helena Wright Margot, the woman who built a hotel empire by stepping on anyone in her way. You always were too naive to see the truth about people." "The truth?" I repeated, feeling anger rise in my chest. "What truth would that be, Jake? That she worked her entire life to build something meaningful while the rest of you just waited for her to die so you could inherit it?" "Enough!" My father barked, his face reddening with rage. "You don't get to lecture us about family values when you couldn't even be bothered to visit her in the hospital." The accusation was carefully crafted to wound, and it succeeded. I had tried to visit, but every attempt had been blocked by my family's claims that I was upsetting her recovery. They'd convinced the hospital staff that my presence agitated her condition, effectively cutting me off from saying goodbye. Attorney Whitman stood gathering the sealed letter and moving toward his office door. "This discussion ends now. Margot, if you'll join me in my private office, we can address your grandmother's final wishes." As I followed him toward the inner door, I could feel my family's collective stare burning into my back. Their whispered arguments filled the conference room, but I couldn't make out specific words over the rushing sound of blood in my ears. The private office was smaller but more personal, with photographs of Whitman's own family decorating the walls alongside his law degrees. He gestured toward a comfortable leather chair before settling behind his desk with the mysterious envelope. "Before we begin," he said gently, "I want you to understand that your grandmother spent considerable time preparing this letter. She was lucid, determined, and very specific about timing. Whatever you're about to read, she wanted you to have privacy to process it." I nodded, accepting the envelope with shaking hands. Helena's familiar handwriting adorned the front, "For my granddaughter Margot, with love and hope for justice." Justice. The word sent chills down my spine as I carefully opened the seal. My hands trembled as I unfolded the handwritten pages, recognizing my grandmother's careful script despite the slight shakiness that betrayed her final illness. The letter began with words that immediately brought tears to my eyes. "My dearest Margot, if you're reading this, then my greatest fears about our family have proven true, and my plan to protect you has begun." I looked up at Attorney Whitman, who nodded encouragingly before I continued reading. "I know you're confused and hurt by what just happened in that conference room. The $1 I left you was not cruelty, my sweet girl, but a symbol. In a family that has valued money above everything else, you remained the only person with genuine integrity. That single dollar represents something far more valuable than the fortune they believe they've inherited." My breath caught as I read the next paragraph. "I've been aware for over 2 years that your parents and Jake have been systematically stealing from my hotel business. They believed my mild confusion about day-to-day details meant I couldn't understand complex financial matters. They were wrong. I've been secretly working with a private investigator named Patricia Stone to document their crimes." The words swam on the page as their meaning sank in. My family weren't just cruel and money-obsessed, they were criminals. And somehow, my grandmother had been protecting me from knowledge that could have destroyed my life. The investigation has uncovered over $2 million in fraudulent transfers, forged documents, and unauthorized account access. Your father used his power of attorney privileges to move money from my business accounts into shell companies controlled by Jake's law firm. Your mother convinced me to sign documents she claimed were routine business matters, but which actually gave them access to funds meant for hotel maintenance and employee pensions. I had to stop reading to catch my breath. $2 million. The number was staggering, but more shocking was the systematic nature of their betrayal. These weren't desperate people making poor decisions. They were calculating thieves who'd spent years planning to rob an elderly woman. I chose not to confront them directly because I feared they might escalate their efforts or find ways to implicate you in their schemes. Instead, I've been preparing evidence for authorities while protecting your innocence. You were never part of their conversations because they knew you wouldn't approve. Your absence from their criminal activities is what makes you the perfect person to seek justice." The letter continued with practical instructions that made my head spin. There was a second will, the real one, hidden in a safety deposit box at First National Bank. The will being read today was a decoy designed to flush out my family's true nature while giving them a false sense of security. Meet with Patricia Stone tomorrow at 10 in the morning at Corner Coffee on Madison Street. She'll be wearing a blue scarf and carrying a newspaper. Tell her that Helena sent you to collect the summer stories. She'll understand what you mean and will provide you with copies of all evidence we've gathered." I read the last paragraph twice to ensure I understood correctly. The real will leaves my entire estate to you, Margot. Not because you're my favorite grandchild, but because you're the only family member who hasn't stolen from me. The hotel business, the properties, the investments, all of it becomes your responsibility to either continue or liquidate as you see fit. Use this inheritance wisely and remember that justice delayed is not justice denied. The letter was signed, "With all my love and faith in your courage, Grandmother Helena." I sat in stunned silence for several minutes while Attorney Whitman waited patiently. Finally, I found my voice. "Did you know?" I whispered. "About the investigation, the real will?" He nodded solemnly. "Your grandmother was my client for over 30 years. She came to me 18 months ago with concerns about financial irregularities. When the evidence became overwhelming, we developed this strategy together. She wanted to give your family enough rope to hang themselves while keeping you safe." "But why didn't she just call the police? Why go through all this elaborate planning?" "Because white-collar crime investigations can take years, and evidence gathered by private parties isn't always admissible in court. She needed your family to believe they'd gotten away with it, so they'd become careless. Their behavior today, their cruelty toward you, their satisfaction with the fake, well, all of it demonstrates their mindset and motivations." I folded the letter carefully, my mind racing with implications. What happens now? Do I just walk out there and pretend nothing's changed? That would be advisable. Whitman agreed. Let them enjoy their victory for now. Meet with Patricia Stone, review the evidence, and then we'll determine the best path forward. Your grandmother wanted you to have all the facts before making any decisions about prosecution. Standing on shaking legs, I tucked the letter into my purse and moved toward the door. The weight of knowledge felt crushing my entire family. Weren't just selfish people. They were criminals who'd spent years systematically robbing the woman who'd raised them. As I reached for the door handle, Whitman spoke again. "Margot, your grandmother believed in you completely. She saw strength in you that perhaps you don't recognize yet. Trust that strength." I nodded without turning around, afraid that if I looked at him, I'd start crying and never stop. Instead, I opened the door and walked back into the conference room where my family waited with poorly concealed anxiety. "Well," my mother demanded immediately, "what did she say?" I forced myself to meet her eyes, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in my adult life. "She said goodbye." I answered truthfully, though not completely. Jake studied my face with the suspicious intensity that had made him successful in court. "That's it. She demanded privacy just to say goodbye." "She apologized," I added, improvising carefully, "for the $1 bequest. She said she hoped I'd understand someday that love can't be measured in money." The visible relief on their faces was sickening. They'd been terrified that Helena had somehow outsmarted them from beyond the grave, but my words confirmed their belief that they'd successfully manipulated a dying woman. "Well," Tiffany said with false sympathy, "at least she acknowledged how unfair the will was. That's something, I suppose." My father stood and moved to put what he probably intended as a comforting hand on my shoulder. I stepped back instinctively, unable to bear his touch, knowing what I now knew. "Don't take it too hard, sweetheart," he said in the patronizing tone he'd used throughout my childhood. "Your grandmother was confused at the end. The important thing is that the family business stays in capable hands." Capable hands. The irony was overwhelming, but I managed to nod and gather my things without revealing the storm of emotions churning in my stomach. As we prepared to leave the law office, Jake approached me with what might have been genuine concern if I hadn't just learned he was a criminal. "Are you going to be okay, sis?" he asked, using the childhood nickname that now felt like mockery. "I know you had some kind of special relationship with her." "I'll be fine." I managed, though fine seemed like an impossible destination from where I currently stood. As we walked toward the elevator, I could hear my parents and Jake already discussing their inheritance plans in excited whispers. Hotel renovations, property developments, investment strategies. They were spending Helena's money before her body was even cold in the ground. But they had no idea what was coming. Tomorrow morning, I would meet with Patricia Stone and learn the full scope of their crimes. And then somehow I would have to find the courage my grandmother believed I possessed. The elevator doors closed, trapping me with 3 people I'd loved and trusted my entire life, who had been stealing from an elderly woman while planning her funeral. As we descended toward the lobby, I realized this was the last time I'd ever see them as family. Tomorrow, everything would change. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching my internal weather perfectly. I'd spent the entire night staring at my bedroom ceiling, replaying Helena's letter, word by word, while trying to process the magnitude of what I'd learned. Every childhood memory now carried new weight. Family gatherings, where my parents discussed Helena's confusion with knowing glances, Jake's sudden interest in elder law despite his corporate practice, the way they'd gradually isolated her from longtime friends and advisors. Corner Coffee on Madison Street buzzed with typical Tuesday morning energy when I arrived 5 minutes early. Office workers grabbed their caffeine fixes before facing another day in Chicago's financial district, and I envied their normal problems. Job stress and commute delays seemed wonderfully simple compared to discovering your entire family were criminals. I spotted Patricia Stone immediately. She sat alone at a corner table, a blue silk scarf draped elegantly around her neck, despite the warm September weather. The newspaper folded beside her coffee cup appeared untouched, clearly serving as a prop rather than reading material. She looked like exactly what I'd expected from a private investigator professional, but approachable with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. My legs felt unsteady as I approached her table. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "Helena sent me to collect the summer stories." Patricia's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine warmth. She gestured to the empty chair across from her, and I noticed her movements were economical and purposeful. "You must be Margot," she said, extending a firm handshake. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman, brilliant, determined, and incredibly brave." I accepted the offered seat gratefully, my knees feeling unreliable after a sleepless night. "Thank you. I'm still trying to process everything from her letter. Part of me keeps hoping this is all some terrible misunderstanding." Patricia's expression grew serious as she reached into a leather briefcase beside her chair. "I wish I could tell you it was a misunderstanding, but the evidence is overwhelming and thoroughly documented. Your grandmother was incredibly methodical about building an airtight case." She placed a thick manila folder on the table between us, and I stared at it like it might explode. The label read, "Richardson Family Financial Crimes Investigation," in Helena's neat handwriting. Before we dive into specifics, Patricia continued, "I want you to understand the scope of what we uncovered. This isn't a case of poor judgment or family members taking advantage of generous loans. This is systematic, premeditated theft spanning nearly 5 years." My coffee grew cold as Patricia opened the folder and began laying out photocopied documents. Bank statements, forged signatures, email communications, legal documents, the evidence spread across our small table like pieces of a horrifying jigsaw puzzle. "It started small," she explained, pointing to the earliest bank records. "Your father had legitimate power of attorney for your grandmother's personal accounts, which was appropriate given her occasional memory lapses. But instead of using that authority to help manage her affairs, he began transferring funds to accounts controlled by your brother's law firm." The numbers on the statements made my stomach lurch. Transfers of $20,000, $30,000, sometimes $50,000, all authorized by my father's forged signatures, claiming various emergency expenses. Jake created shell companies with names similar to Helena's legitimate business expenses. Patricia continued her finger tracing a pattern of deception that had been invisible to me. Superior Hotel Maintenance instead of Central Hotel Maintenance, Executive Property Solutions instead of Executive Property Services. The differences were subtle enough that Helena's accountant didn't catch the substitutions immediately. I studied an email chain that made my hands shake with rage. Jake had written to my parents about maximizing our opportunities while the old lady's still signing whatever we put in front of her. The casual cruelty of referring to our grandmother as the old lady while plotting to rob her felt like a physical blow. Your mother played a crucial role. Patricia continued producing a series of photographs that had clearly been taken with hidden cameras. She would visit Helena regularly, bringing documents she claimed were routine business matters, insurance updates, vendor agreements, property transfers. Helena trusted her completely and signed everything Susan presented. The photos showed my mother sitting beside Helena's hospital bed, spreading papers across the blanket while my grandmother's weakened condition made careful reading impossible. In one image, my mother was actually guiding Helena's hand to sign a document. What was she signing? I whispered, afraid of the answer. Property deeds transferring 3 of Helena's rental buildings into Jake's name. Loan agreements authorizing your father to access business accounts for non-existent emergency repairs. Investment authorizations, moving Helena's retirement funds into high-risk schemes that coincidentally paid massive commissions to your brother's firm. Patricia paused to let the information sink in before delivering what felt like the final blow. The total theft amounts to $2.7 million over the past 5 years. But here's what makes this case particularly strong. From a legal standpoint, your grandmother wasn't nearly as confused as they believed. She had early-stage dementia, yes, but her cognitive function was much better than your family realized. She was actually quite aware of what was happening. Then why didn't she stop them? Because she wanted to protect you, Patricia replied simply. Helena knew that if she confronted them directly, they might try to implicate you as either an accomplice or a co-conspirator. Your distance from their schemes was what kept you safe, but it also meant you couldn't help her fight back. Patricia reached into her briefcase again and produced another folder, this one labeled Helena Richardson, Last Will and Testament Original. Your grandmother came to me after she started noticing financial irregularities. We spent months documenting everything while she pretended her condition was worse than it actually was. The will read yesterday was a decoy designed to make your family believe they'd succeeded in their theft. She opened the folder to reveal a legal document that made my heart stop. Every line item that had gone to my parents and Jake in yesterday's reading was now assigned to me. The hotel business, the real estate properties, the investment accounts, everything. The real estate alone is worth over $8 million, Patricia explained. The hotel business generates approximately $1.2 million annually in profit. Your grandmother's investment portfolio before your family's theft was valued at just under $4 million. The numbers were so staggering they felt abstract. I'd grown up in comfortable middle-class circumstances, never imagining the true scope of Helena's wealth. More importantly, I'd never imagined the extent of my family's greed. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely audible over the coffee shop's ambient noise. Patricia's smile carried a hint of satisfaction that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. Now we present all evidence to the Cook County District Attorney's Office and watch your family face the consequences of their crimes. But first, Helena wanted you to have the choice about prosecution. This is your decision, Margot. I stared at the evidence covering our table, years of systematic theft, betrayal, and manipulation of an elderly woman by the people who should have protected her. The scope of their crimes was overwhelming, but what hurt most was the calculated nature of their cruelty. They never loved her. I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. All those years, all those family dinners and holiday celebrations, they were just waiting for her to die so they could take everything. Your grandmother understood that, Patricia replied gently, but she also believed that justice delayed isn't justice denied. She spent her final months ensuring they'd face consequences for their choices. As I looked at the evidence of my family's crimes, I felt something shifting inside me. The naive young woman who'd walked into that law office yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes love means holding people accountable for their actions. What do we do first? I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Patricia's smile was the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen since this nightmare began. First, we go to the bank and access Helena's real will, then we make some very important phone calls. For the first time since yesterday's humiliation, I felt like I could breathe. My grandmother had given me more than money, she'd given me the tools for justice. The weight of evidence in my purse felt heavier than any burden I'd ever carried as I drove toward my parents' house that evening. Patricia Stone had spent the afternoon walking me through legal procedures, potential timelines, and the likely consequences my family would face once criminal charges were filed. The reality of what came next was both terrifying and strangely liberating. My parents lived in the same sprawling suburban home where I'd grown up, a testament to my father's successful accounting practice and my mother's real estate investments. Now I understood that much of their apparent prosperity had been built on money stolen from my grandmother. Even the recent kitchen renovation, which my mother had proudly shown off at Easter dinner, had likely been paid for with Helena's funds. Jake's BMW sat in the driveway alongside Tiffany's Mercedes, suggesting this was a planned family gathering to celebrate their inheritance. The thought made my stomach churn, but it also strengthened my resolve. They were probably inside right now, toasting their successful manipulation of a dying woman. My mother answered the door wearing her favorite cocktail dress, the one she reserved for special occasions. Her smile was broader than I'd seen in months, and she pulled me into an embrace that felt like a lie against my skin. "Margot, sweetheart, perfect timing. We're just opening champagne to celebrate Helena's legacy. It's what she would have wanted." The casual blasphemy of that statement nearly made me vomit. Helena would have wanted justice, truth, and accountability, everything this family had systematically denied her. I followed my mother into the familiar living room where my father and Jake stood beside the fireplace with crystal champagne flutes. Tiffany lounged on the leather sofa, her manicured nails tapping against her glass, in a rhythm that seemed to mock the gravity of what I now knew. "There's our girl," my father called out with artificial joviality. "Come get a drink. We're toasting new beginnings." Jake approached with a champagne flute, his law school ring catching the lamplight as he extended the glass toward me. "To family," he said, raising his own drink. "And to Helena's final gift to all of us." I accepted the champagne but didn't drink, watching their faces as they celebrated their successful theft. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. These were people I'd loved and trusted for 29 years, yet they were capable of robbing an elderly woman without a parent conscience. "So," my mother said, settling into her favorite armchair, "now that the unpleasantness is behind us, we need to discuss practical matters. The hotel business needs immediate attention, and there are properties that could be developed into much more profitable ventures." Tiffany leaned forward eagerly, her real estate expertise finally relevant to family business. "I've already identified 3 properties that would be perfect for luxury condominiums. The rental income Helena was collecting was criminally low compared to development potential." "Criminally low," I repeated, tasting the irony of her word choice. "Exactly," Jake agreed, missing my tone entirely. Helena was too sentimental about maintaining affordable housing options. Business is business. We maximize profit or we're not fulfilling our fiduciary responsibilities. My father nodded approvingly, swirling his champagne with satisfaction. "That's exactly the kind of clear thinking Helena's estate needs. No more emotional decision-making, just sound financial strategy." I set down my untouched champagne and looked around the room at these people who shared my DNA, but apparently none of my values. "Speaking of financial strategy," I said carefully, "I've been thinking about some irregularities I noticed in Helena's accounts." The change in atmosphere was immediate and electric. Jake's champagne flute froze halfway to his lips, while my mother's smile faltered around the edges. My father's expression shifted into what I recognized as his professional accountant mode, controlled, calculated, defensive. "What kind of irregularities?" Jake asked, his lawyer instincts engaging instantly. "Just some transfers that seemed unusual," I replied, keeping my voice light despite my racing heartbeat. Large amounts moved to companies I didn't recognize. Patricia Stone helped me understand some of the financial documents. The mention of Patricia's name sent a visible shock through the room. Tiffany sat up abruptly, her casual elegance replaced by sharp attention. My parents exchanged a look that confirmed they recognized the investigator's name. "Who is Patricia Stone?" my mother asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "A private investigator Helena hired." I answered honestly, watching their faces carefully. "She's been helping me understand the complexities of the estate." Jake set down his champagne and moved closer, his imposing frame suddenly feeling threatening rather than protective. "Margot, I think you're misunderstanding some routine business transactions. Estate management involves many complex financial instruments that might seem irregular to someone without legal or accounting training." "I see," I replied, though I saw far more than they realized. So those shell companies with names similar to Helena's legitimate vendors, those were routine business transactions. My father's face reddened with what I initially mistook for anger but now recognized as fear. "You need to be very careful about making accusations you don't understand, Margot. Questioning legitimate business practices can have serious legal consequences." "Legal consequences," I repeated, amazed by their audacity. "For questioning financial irregularities in my grandmother's accounts? For harassment?" Tiffany interjected smoothly, her real estate training apparently including conflict management. "Making unfounded accusations against family members could be construed as an attempt to manipulate estate proceedings." Jake nodded approvingly at his wife's legal maneuvering. "Exactly. And given your recent emotional instability following Helena's death, such accusations might be seen as evidence of deeper psychological issues." The threat was delivered with surgical precision designed to make me question not just my actions, but my sanity. They were already laying groundwork to discredit any accusations I might make, painting me as an unstable woman, making wild claims about imaginary crimes. Emotional instability. I asked, genuinely curious about how they justify such a characterization. "Well, sweetheart," my mother said with false sympathy, "you have been acting quite strangely since the will reading. This obsession with financial details, hiring investigators, making vague accusations, it's concerning behavior." My father approached with the patronizing expression he'd used throughout my childhood whenever I'd questioned family decisions. "We're worried about you, Margot. This kind of paranoid thinking isn't healthy. Maybe you should consider talking to someone professional about processing your grief." The manipulation was masterful and completely terrifying. They were systematically undermining my credibility while positioning themselves as concerned family members dealing with an unstable relative. If I hadn't seen Patricia Stone's evidence, I might have started doubting my own perceptions. "You're right," I said, finally standing and gathering my purse. "I should talk to someone professional, several someones actually." Jake's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm taking your advice about seeking professional help," I replied, moving toward the door. "Thank you for the champagne and the education about financial irregularities." As I reached for the door handle, my mother called out with genuine alarm in her voice. "Margot, wait! Where are you going? We need to finish discussing estate management." I turned back to look at them one final time, seeing them clearly for what they truly were. "I think our discussion is finished," I said. "But don't worry, there will be plenty more opportunities to talk about Helena's estate management. Many, many opportunities." I left them standing in stunned silence, their celebration cut short by the realization that their manipulation of a confused elderly woman might not have been as successful as they'd believed. As I drove away from the house where I'd grown up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that I was doing the right thing. Tomorrow, the real consequences of their choices would begin. They had no idea what was coming, but they were about to learn that Helena had raised one grandchild who couldn't be bought intimidated or silenced. I barely made it through my apartment door before my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed Jake's number, but I let it go to voicemail along with the 6 other calls that followed in rapid succession. My hands shook as I poured myself a glass of wine, trying to process the evening's confrontation and what it meant for tomorrow's plans with Patricia Stone. The silence in my studio apartment felt oppressive after the emotional intensity of my family's house. I'd moved here 2 years ago, when my marketing coordinator's salary finally allowed independence from my parents' financial support. Now I wondered how much of their supposed generosity had actually been funded by money stolen from my grandmother. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Margot, please call us back. We need to discuss your concerning behavior before you do something you'll regret." The implied threat was clear, but before I could respond, my building's intercom system crackled to life. My doorman's voice carried an unusual note of concern. "Miss Richardson, there are 2 gentlemen here to see you. They say they're family, but they don't seem—" He paused diplomatically. "Would you like me to send them up?" My blood ran cold. I moved to my window and peered down at the street below, spotting Jake's BMW parked illegally in front of a fire hydrant. He'd brought reinforcement, a tall man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate law firm. "Please tell them I'm not available," I told the doorman. "They're quite insistent, miss. The younger man says it's about your grandmother's estate and that it's urgent family business." I could imagine Jake using his most authoritative lawyer voice to intimidate my building staff. "Please ask them to leave and call building security if they refuse. I don't want to see them." 20 minutes later, as I tried to calm my nerves with a hot shower, my phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed an unknown number with a Chicago area code. Margot Richardson. The voice was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. "Yes. My name is Marcus Reed from Reed Sterling and Associates. I represent the Richardson family estate interests. I believe we need to schedule a meeting to discuss some very serious legal matters." The name hit me like a physical blow. Jake had mentioned hiring Marcus Reed to contest any alternative will, but I hadn't expected him to move so quickly. "What legal matters?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's come to my attention that you've been making unfounded accusations against family members regarding estate management. Additionally, there are concerns about your mental state and possible attempts to manipulate inheritance proceedings through fraudulent claims." The script was perfectly crafted, professional, concerned, and designed to make me sound like an unstable woman making wild accusations. "I haven't made any accusations," I replied carefully. "I've simply asked questions about financial irregularities." "Miss Richardson, let me be very clear about your situation. My clients have documented evidence of your erratic behavior following your grandmother's death. They have witnesses to your paranoid accusations records of your hiring private investigators to harass family members and serious concerns about your mental competency." My apartment suddenly felt like a trap, the walls closing in, as I realized how thoroughly they'd prepared for this moment. Mental competency. Your family is prepared to petition for a psychological evaluation based on your recent behavior. Additionally, any attempts to challenge the properly executed will, through fabricated evidence, will result in immediate legal action for fraud, harassment, and attempted theft. The threats were delivered with surgical precision, each word chosen to maximize intimidation while maintaining plausible legal ground. I sank onto my couch, feeling overwhelmed by the sophisticated nature of their counterattack. "However," Reed continued, "my clients are willing to offer a generous settlement to avoid the unpleasantness of a public family dispute. They're prepared to offer you $200,000 in exchange for your agreement to accept the will as read and cease all investigation activities." $200,000. The amount was significant enough to sound generous while representing a tiny fraction of what they'd actually stolen. It was also precisely calculated to tempt someone they believed was financially struggling. "And if I refuse, then you'll face the full legal consequences of your actions," Harassment charges, defamation suits, psychological competency hearings, and civil litigation that will drain any resources you might have. My clients have unlimited legal resources and the patience to pursue every available remedy. The message was unmistakable. Accept their generous offer or be destroyed by legal warfare they were prepared to fund indefinitely. It was exactly the kind of calculated intimidation that had probably worked countless times before with other victims. "I need time to consider your offer," I said, buying space to think. "Of course. Take the evening to reflect on your situation, but understand that this offer expires tomorrow at noon, and withdrawal of our generous proposal will signal the beginning of very serious legal consequences." After Reed disconnected, I sat in my apartment's growing darkness, feeling more isolated than ever before. They'd moved with shocking speed and coordination, suggesting this contingency plan had been prepared long before yesterday's will reading. They'd anticipated the possibility of challenge and developed a comprehensive strategy to discredit and intimidate any opposition. My phone buzzed with another text, this time from Tiffany. "Margot, please reconsider whatever you're planning. Marcus Reed is one of the most ruthless attorneys in Chicago. You don't want to make an enemy of him." The warning carried an undertone of genuine concern, but I couldn't tell if Tiffany was trying to help me or simply delivering another threat disguised as advice. An hour later, my building's intercom crackled again. This time, my doorman's voice carried clear alarm. "Miss Richardson, there's a man here with legal papers. He says he needs to serve you personally." My heart pounded as I realized they weren't waiting until tomorrow. Whatever legal action they'd threatened was beginning immediately. "Can you accept the papers on my behalf?" "He's insisting on personal service, miss. Says it's regarding mental competency proceedings and that he needs to verify your identity." Mental competency proceedings. They weren't just threatening anymore, they were actually petitioning to have me declared mentally incompetent, which would effectively prevent me from challenging their theft or accessing Helena's real will. I moved to my window again and spotted 2 more cars on the street below. They'd essentially surrounded my building with legal representatives, creating a coordinated show of force designed to demonstrate their resources and determination. My phone rang with yet another unknown number. "Margot." Jake's voice carried a false note of brotherly concern. "I know this seems overwhelming, but we're trying to help you. Mental health evaluations aren't punishment, they're protection for everyone involved." Protection. You're clearly struggling with grief and making irrational decisions that could hurt yourself and the family. The competency hearing is just a precaution to ensure you get appropriate help. The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. They were framing criminal prosecution as mental illness, legal evidence as paranoid delusions, and their own theft as concerned family protection. "Marcus Reed's offer is incredibly generous," Jake continued. $200,000 would set you up comfortably while allowing the family to heal from this unfortunate situation. And if I refuse, then we'll have no choice but to protect ourselves through legal means. Nobody wants to see family business aired in public court proceedings, Margot. Think about Helena's reputation, her legacy. Do you really want her memory associated with ugly accusations and family destruction? The final manipulation was perfect, using my love for Helena against me, suggesting that seeking justice for her would somehow damage her memory. They were experts at finding emotional pressure points and exploiting them ruthlessly. As Jake continued his persuasive monologue, I realized that everything Patricia Stone had told me was not just true, but understated. These weren't simply greedy relatives who'd made poor choices. They were sophisticated criminals who'd planned every aspect of their theft, including comprehensive strategies for dealing with potential opposition. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed I was the same naive woman who'd walked into that law office yesterday, someone who could be intimidated into silence through threats and legal maneuvering. They had no idea that Helena had prepared me for exactly this moment, or that the evidence Patricia Stone possessed was far more comprehensive than they realized. "I'll consider your offer," I told Jake, ending the call before he could respond. But I'd already made my decision. Tomorrow morning, I would meet with Patricia Stone and begin the process of holding them accountable for their crimes, regardless of the personal consequences. They wanted a war. Helena had given me everything I needed to fight one. Wednesday morning arrived with a phone call that shattered any remaining illusions about my family's methods. My supervisor, Carol Martinez's voice carried the uncomfortable formality that meant serious trouble. "Margot, I need you to come in for a meeting this morning. Please report directly to Human Resources when you arrive." My stomach dropped as I recognized the tone from previous workplace crises I'd witnessed. "Is everything all right? Did I miss something urgent?" "We'll discuss everything when you get here," Carol replied, offering no reassurance. "Please come in as soon as possible." The drive to my downtown marketing firm felt surreal, like traveling through a nightmare where familiar landmarks had taken on ominous significance. I'd worked at Creative Solutions Marketing for 3 years, building strong relationships with clients and colleagues while developing campaigns for mid-sized businesses throughout the Chicago area. My professional life had been the one stable element during family chaos, and now even that sanctuary felt threatened. Human Resources Director Jennifer Walsh greeted me with the careful neutrality that meant legal consultation had already occurred. Her normally warm demeanor was replaced by procedural distance as she gestured toward the conference room where Carol waited with 2 people I didn't recognize. "Margot, please have a seat." Jennifer began consulting a file folder that appeared surprisingly thick for someone who'd never had disciplinary issues. "We've received some concerning reports about your recent behavior and mental state." The phrase "mental state" sent chills down my spine, confirming that my family's intimidation campaign had extended beyond legal threats to systematic character assassination. "What kind of reports?" I asked, though I already suspected the source. "Multiple calls from family members expressing concern about your psychological stability following a recent death." Carol explained her discomfort with the situation, evident in her refusal to meet my eyes. "Specifically reports that you've been making paranoid accusations, hiring investigators to harass relatives, and displaying signs of persecution complex." One of the strangers, a middle-aged man in a conservative suit, leaned forward with practiced authority. "I'm Dr. Richard Hayes from Employee Assistance Programs. I understand you've experienced a significant loss recently, which can trigger various psychological responses, including paranoia, delusional thinking, and aggressive behavior toward family members." The setup was masterful in its clinical precision. They'd brought in a mental health professional to pathologize my completely rational response to discovering criminal behavior, while positioning my family as concerned relatives seeking help for a disturbed woman. "Who specifically contacted you?" I asked Jennifer, needing to understand the scope of their campaign. "Your brother Jake Richardson called Monday evening expressing concerns about your mental health following your grandmother's funeral. Your parents followed up yesterday with additional documentation of troubling behavior patterns. Jake had contacted my employer before I'd even met with Patricia Stone, suggesting their intimidation strategy had been planned with military-like precision. They'd identified every aspect of my life that could be threatened and moved simultaneously to undermine my credibility." "What kind of documentation?" Carol consulted her notes with obvious reluctance. "Reports of erratic behavior at family gatherings, accusations against relatives regarding financial impropriety, hiring private investigators to harass family members, and statements suggesting conspiracy theories about inheritance fraud." Every legitimate concern I'd raised had been reframed as evidence of mental illness, while my family's actual crimes were dismissed as paranoid fantasies. The clinical language made my rational responses sound like textbook symptoms of psychological breakdown. Dr. Hayes opened his own folder, revealing forms that looked suspiciously like involuntary commitment paperwork. "Miss Richardson, your family is concerned that grief has triggered a psychological crisis requiring immediate intervention. They've requested that we facilitate professional evaluation to ensure you receive appropriate treatment." "Treatment for what exactly?" "Acute stress reaction with paranoid features. he replied smoothly, using terminology that sounded official while being vague enough to justify almost any intervention. Your allegations against family members combined with obsessive investigation behaviors suggest you're experiencing reality distortion that could become dangerous without proper support. Jennifer shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly struggling with a situation that felt wrong despite its apparent legal justification. Margot, we've also received complaints from other employees about your recent behavior. Distraction, emotional outbursts, discussing family conspiracies during work hours. This was news to me since I hadn't discussed Helena's situation with anyone at work. Which employees made these complaints? I can't reveal specific names, but multiple colleagues have expressed concern about your mental state and its impact on workplace dynamics. The lies were becoming more elaborate, suggesting they'd either fabricated witness statements or somehow convinced my coworkers to participate in character assassination. I realized that challenging these claims would only reinforce their narrative that I was paranoid and delusional. So, what happens now? I asked, recognizing that this meeting was a conclusion rather than a discussion. Carol's expression carried genuine regret as she delivered what was clearly a predetermined decision. We're placing you on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation and treatment. Your family has provided contact information for mental health professionals who can assess your condition and recommend appropriate intervention. Administrative leave. The euphemism meant I was being suspended based on unsubstantiated allegations from the same people who were stealing from my grandmother. My career, my financial independence, and my professional reputation were being systematically destroyed to prevent me from seeking justice. This is retaliation, I said quietly, not expecting them to acknowledge the obvious truth. Dr. Hayes made notes on his forms with practiced efficiency. Miss Richardson's hostility toward people trying to help you is another concerning symptom. Persecution complex often involves interpreting assistance as attack, which reinforces the need for immediate professional intervention. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking. Any response I made compliance resistance or questioning could be interpreted as evidence supporting their predetermined conclusion that I was mentally ill and dangerous. Jennifer handed me a packet of papers that included leave procedures, insurance information, and contact details for the mental health professionals my family had recommended. We hope you'll take advantage of this opportunity to address your grief in a healthy way, Margot. Your job will be waiting when you're ready to return to work. The conditional phrasing suggested my return depended entirely on psychological evaluations, controlled by professionals my family had selected. They'd created a system where my freedom and financial security required accepting their version of reality and abandoning any pursuit of justice for Helena. As I left the office building where I'd worked for 3 years, I felt the full weight of their coordinated assault. They'd attacked my credibility, my mental health, claims, my professional standing, and my financial independence, simultaneously creating multiple pressure points designed to force submission. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Margot, this is Dr. Patricia Chen from Chicago Mental Health Associates. Your family has scheduled an emergency evaluation for this afternoon. Please call immediately to confirm your appointment time. They weren't even pretending to give me choice anymore. The mental health evaluation was scheduled whether I agreed or not, and my failure to appear would probably be used as evidence of non-compliance, requiring more aggressive intervention. Walking to my car in the office parking garage, I spotted Jake's BMW parked near the entrance. He'd been waiting to observe my reaction to their latest assault, probably gathering intelligence about my emotional state to share with their hand-picked mental health professionals. I approached his car directly, no longer caring about strategic concealment. He rolled down his window with the satisfied expression of someone watching a perfectly executed plan unfold. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" I asked, surprising him with my calm tone. "It doesn't have to be," he replied, switching to false brotherly concern. "Accept the mental health support we're offering, take the settlement Marcus Reed proposed, and we can put all this behind us." "And if I refuse?" Jake's mask of concern slipped, revealing the calculating predator underneath. Then you'll discover exactly how comprehensive our documentation of your mental breakdown has become. Hospital records, police reports, workplace incidents. We've been preparing for your inevitable crisis for months. The admission confirmed what I'd suspected. This wasn't a reaction to my discovery of their crimes, but a premeditated campaign designed to neutralize any potential opposition. They'd been planning my character destruction long before Helena's death, probably as insurance against the possibility that someone might question their theft. "You've thought of everything," I observed, genuinely impressed by the scope of their criminal sophistication. "We protect our family's interests," Jake replied coldly. "Helena's confused allegations don't change the fact that we've built successful lives that won't be destroyed by a grieving woman's paranoid fantasies." As I walked away from his car, I realized that everything Patricia Stone had told me about white-collar criminals was proving accurate. They didn't just steal money, they systematically destroyed anyone who threatened their schemes, using legal, professional, and medical systems as weapons against their victims. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They assumed that isolation and intimidation would break my resolve, when actually their escalating attacks were confirming everything Helena had warned me about in her letter. I had a choice to make: submit to their psychological manipulation and accept their settlement, or trust that Helena had given me tools powerful enough to fight sophisticated criminals. As I drove toward my meeting with Patricia Stone, I felt something shifting inside me. The naive woman who'd believed in family loyalty was gone, replaced by someone who understood that justice sometimes required war. They wanted to destroy my credibility. They were about to learn what happened when someone with nothing left to lose decided to fight back. Patricia Stone took one look at my face when I arrived at her office and immediately locked the door behind me. Her private investigation firm occupied the third floor of a downtown building that specialized in discreet professional services, and her reception area projected the kind of understated competence that wealthy clients required for sensitive matters. "They moved faster than I expected," she said, gesturing me toward a chair in her inner office. "Tell me what's happened since yesterday." I recounted the previous evening's intimidation campaign and this morning's workplace ambush, watching Patricia's expression grow increasingly grim. She took detailed notes while I spoke occasionally, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her familiarity with sophisticated criminal defense strategies. "This is textbook behavior for white-collar criminals when they feel cornered," she confirmed when I finished. "They're using what we call the discredit and destroy strategy, systematically undermining your credibility, while positioning themselves as concerned family members dealing with an unstable relative." "How do we fight it?" Patricia opened her desk drawer and removed a small digital device that looked like a high-end voice recorder. "Helena anticipated this possibility. She left instructions that if your family escalated to character assassination, I should share what she called the Summer Stories location." The phrase triggered a childhood memory so vivid it took my breath away. Helena's garden shed, where she'd kept boxes of children's books and told elaborate stories during summer visits when I was 8 or 9 years old. We'd spent countless hours in that peaceful space while she invented tales about brave princesses who overcame impossible odds through cleverness and courage. "The shed behind her house," I whispered. Patricia nodded approvingly. "Helena said you'd remember immediately. She hid something there specifically for you to find something that would provide irrefutable evidence of your family's crimes." The drive to Helena's house felt like traveling backward through time. The property had been my refuge during difficult periods of childhood and adolescence, when family tensions made home feel unsafe. Helena had always provided unconditional acceptance and wisdom, creating space for me to be authentically myself without judgment or manipulation. The house itself stood empty and slightly neglected, with realtor signs indicating it was already being prepared for sale by my family. They'd wasted no time beginning the process of liquidating Helena's assets, probably eager to convert everything into cash before any investigations could freeze accounts. The garden shed occupied the back corner of Helena's property, partially hidden by the apple trees she'd planted decades earlier. The small wooden structure looked exactly as I remembered, weathered but sturdy with windows that let in natural light and shelves lined with books, gardening tools, and childhood treasures. Inside, everything was precisely as Helena had left it. Children's books arranged by reading-level comfortable cushions for storytelling sessions, and the old wooden chest where she'd kept special supplies for rainy day activities. According to Patricia's instructions, I needed to look for a hidden panel behind the bookshelf containing fairy tale collections. My fingers traced the edges of the bookshelf until I found a loose board near the bottom. The panel swung aside to reveal a cavity containing a waterproof case marked "Summer Stories for Margot" in Helena's familiar handwriting. The case contained multiple digital recording devices, each labeled with dates spanning the past 2 years. There were also detailed written notes in Helena's careful script documenting conversations and incidents I'd never witnessed or suspected. I selected the device labeled Family Planning Session March 2023 and pressed play, hearing Helena's voice emerge with startling clarity. Testing. Okay, it's working. They think I'm napping, but I can hear everything they're saying in the kitchen. Let me position this closer to the door. What followed was 43 minutes of my family discussing their theft with casual indifference that made my blood run cold. My father's voice was immediately recognizable as he detailed bank transfers and forged documents. "The old woman signed the power of attorney modification yesterday," he said with satisfaction. "She thinks it's just updating emergency contact information, but it actually gives me access to the business accounts Helena's been keeping separate." Jake's voice joined the conversation, outlining legal strategies for concealing their activities. "The shell companies are working perfectly. As long as we keep the transfers under $50,000 per transaction and space them out over several months, the accountant won't notice patterns." My mother's contribution was perhaps most chilling in its calculated cruelty. "Helena's getting more confused about day-to-day details, which makes her easier to manipulate. I brought her more documents to sign this morning while she was still groggy from her medication. She'll sign anything if I present it as routine paperwork." Tiffany's laughter punctuated their discussion of Helena's deteriorating condition. "It's almost too easy. She trusts Susan completely and doesn't read anything carefully anymore. We could probably get her to sign over the entire business if we presented it as updating insurance beneficiaries." The recording captured over an hour of detailed criminal planning, including specific amount-stolen methods for concealing transactions and strategies for manipulating Helena's confusion. But what devastated me most was their casual dismissal of her humanity, referring to her as the old woman, while celebrating her cognitive decline as a business opportunity. I selected another recording labeled Margot Problem Discussion, August 2023, and discovered they'd been planning my character assassination for months before Helena's death. Jake's voice outlined their strategy with legal precision. "If Margot ever gets suspicious about the finances, we need comprehensive documentation of her mental instability. I've already spoken with Dr. Hayes about establishing a paper trail for psychiatric intervention." "What kind of documentation?" my father asked. "Workplace incidents, family confrontations, evidence of paranoid thinking, anything that supports a case for psychological evaluation," Jake explained. "The key is creating a pattern that predates any accusations she might make, so her claims appear to be symptoms rather than legitimate concerns." My mother's voice added another layer of betrayal. "I've been documenting her concerning behavior for 6 months. Mood swings at family dinners, inappropriate questions about Helena's finances, hostility toward family traditions. It's all recorded in my journal with dates and witnesses." They'd been systematically building a false narrative of my mental decline while stealing from Helena, creating preemptive character assassination designed to neutralize any potential opposition. The sophistication of their planning was staggering, suggesting years of preparation for the possibility that someone might challenge their criminal activities. The final recording was labeled Helena's Final Warning, September 2023, and captured a conversation that broke my heart completely. Helena's voice, weakened by illness, but absolutely clear in its reasoning, confronted my family directly about their theft. "I know what you've been doing," she said simply. "I know about the shell companies, the forged documents, the money transfers. I've known for over a year." The stunned silence that followed was eventually broken by Jake's lawyer voice, switching immediately into damage control mode. "Helena, you're confused. We've only been helping manage your affairs according to your instructions." "Don't insult my intelligence," Helena replied with dignity that made tears stream down my face. "I may have some memory issues, but I'm not stupid. I've been documenting everything, and I've made arrangements to ensure you face consequences for your choices." My father's response revealed the true nature of their relationship with her. "Listen, old woman, you're going to sign whatever we put in front of you and keep your mouth shut about family business. We've taken care of you for years, and this is how we collect what we're owed." "You've stolen from me for years," Helena corrected calmly, "and you've isolated me from friends who might have helped me stop you. But you made one crucial mistake. You assumed Margot was as corrupt as the rest of you." The recording captured their threats against me, their plans to destroy my credibility, and Helena's unwavering belief that I would seek justice, regardless of personal consequences. Her final words on the recording became a message directly to me across time and death. "Margot will discover the truth because she's the only family member with integrity. And when she does, you'll finally face consequences for treating an elderly woman like a bank account you're entitled to drain." I sat in Helena's garden shed surrounded by childhood memories and evidence of unimaginable betrayal, understanding finally why she'd chosen me as her instrument of justice. It wasn't about money or inheritance. It was about accountability for people who'd spent years systematically abusing someone who'd loved and trusted them. The recordings provided irrefutable evidence of criminal conspiracy, elder abuse, and premeditated character assassination. But more importantly, they captured the voices and motivations of people who'd revealed their true nature when they thought no one was listening. Patricia Stone had been right. Helena had anticipated every move my family would make and prepared comprehensive evidence to counter their strategies. Now I had tools powerful enough to fight sophisticated criminals who'd underestimated both my grandmother's intelligence and my own determination. As I gathered the evidence and prepared to leave Helena's shed for the last time, I felt her presence like a gentle touch on my shoulder. She'd given me more than proof of their crimes. She'd given me the strength to use it. The real war was about to begin. Monday morning found me sitting in the Cook County District Attorney's office with Patricia Stone and enough evidence to prosecute a complex white-collar crime case. Assistant District Attorney Maria Santos reviewed Helena's recordings with the focused attention of someone who'd built her career on elder abuse prosecutions. "This is extraordinary evidence," she said, pausing the latest recording where my family discussed money laundering procedures. "The quality is excellent, the conversations are clearly incriminating, and the conspiracy involves multiple defendants across several years." Patricia laid out additional documentation while I tried to process the surreal experience of filing criminal charges against my own parents. Bank records, forged documents, email communications, and financial analysis painted a picture of systematic theft that had devastated Helena's estate while enriching my family's lifestyle. The recordings establish clear criminal intent. A.D. Santos continued, "But we'll need additional evidence to prosecute successfully. Financial institutions will need to provide account records and will require expert testimony about the scope of fraudulent activities." "How long will that process take?" I asked, thinking about the pressure campaign my family was already executing. 3 to 6 months for a complete investigation, assuming cooperation from banks and other institutions. However, we can file preliminary charges immediately based on the evidence you've provided." The relief I felt was overwhelming. After days of intimidation and character assassination, the legal system was finally taking my family's crimes seriously. Patricia had prepared me for possible skepticism or bureaucratic delays, but Ada Santos clearly understood the severity of what we'd uncovered. "There is one concern," Santos added, consulting her notes. "Your family has apparently been building a case that you're mentally unstable and making false accusations. That could complicate prosecution if they convince a judge that you're an unreliable witness." Patricia leaned forward with the confidence of someone who'd anticipated this challenge. The recordings speak for themselves regardless of Margot's credibility. Her family's voices are clearly identifiable, and the content demonstrates sophisticated criminal planning over extended periods. True, but defense attorneys will argue that the recordings were obtained illegally, or that your family was humoring what they perceived as Helena's confused allegations. We need to be prepared for aggressive legal challenges. As if summoned by our discussion, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Ada Santos nodded permission for me to answer. Margot Richardson. The voice was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. "Yes. This is Detective Robert Clark with the Chicago Police Department. I need you to come to the station immediately for questioning regarding harassment charges filed against you by the Richardson family." My blood turned to ice as I realized my family had escalated their intimidation campaign to criminal charges. Ada Santos frowned and gestured for me to put the call on speaker. "What specific charges?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "Harassment, stalking, and making false statements to law enforcement," Detective Clark replied. "Your family has provided substantial documentation of threatening behavior and attempted extortion related to inheritance disputes." "Detective, this is Ada Maria Santos. Miss Richardson is currently in my office providing evidence of criminal activity by the same family members who filed these charges. This appears to be retaliation for her cooperation with our investigation." "I understand your position, counselor, but I have warrants that require immediate action. Miss Richardson needs to surrender herself for processing within the next 2 hours or face additional charges for failure to comply." The trap was perfectly executed. My family had used their legal connections to have me arrested on fabricated charges, knowing that criminal prosecution would undermine my credibility and potentially prevent me from testifying against them. Jake's law enforcement contacts were apparently more extensive than I'd realized. Ada Santos ended the call and immediately began making phone calls of her own, trying to coordinate with police leadership about the obvious conflict between my cooperation with their investigation and the charges filed by my family. But bureaucratic processes moved slowly while arrest warrants demanded immediate compliance. "I have to surrender myself." I realized the full implications becoming clear. If I don't, they'll add fleeing charges to whatever else they've fabricated. Patricia Stone's expression was grim but determined. This is exactly the kind of pressure tactic sophisticated criminals use when they feel cornered. They're gambling that arrest and public humiliation will break your resolve. "Will it work?" I asked, genuinely uncertain about my own strength. "That depends entirely on you," Santos replied honestly. "They're betting that you'll accept their settlement offer rather than endure criminal prosecution. But if you maintain your commitment to justice for Helena, we'll continue building the case against them, regardless of these retaliatory charges." 2 hours later, I walked into the Chicago Police Department's downtown precinct, wearing my best professional outfit and carrying Patricia Stone's business card. The booking process was designed to be humiliating and dehumanizing, stripping away dignity while processing me like a common criminal. Detective Clark turned out to be a middle-aged man with tired eyes who seemed uncomfortable with the charges he was required to pursue. As he took my statement, his questions suggested skepticism about the accusations my family had made. "They're claiming you've been harassing them with accusations about financial crimes," he said, consulting a file that appeared surprisingly thick. Phone calls, visits to their homes, hiring investigators to stalk family members. "I asked questions about irregularities in my grandmother's accounts," I replied carefully, and I hired a private investigator to help me understand estate documents. According to their complaint, you've been making wild accusations about money laundering and elder abuse without any supporting evidence. The irony was staggering. I was being arrested for reporting crimes that I could prove conclusively, while my family's false accusations were being treated as legitimate legal complaints. Detective I provided extensive evidence of their crimes to the district attorney's office this morning. Ada Santos can verify that your harassment charges are retaliation for my cooperation with their investigation. Clark made notes but didn't seem particularly impressed by jurisdictional complications between his department and the DA's office. That's above my pay grade, Miss Richardson. Right now, I'm processing charges filed by people who say you've been threatening them. The bail hearing took place in a courtroom that felt like theater, designed to reinforce the power of legal institutions over individual citizens. My family attended in force, dressed professionally, and projecting the image of concerned relatives dealing with a disturbed woman's escalating behavior. Jake's attorney, Marcus Reed, presented their case with polished efficiency, describing me as an increasingly unstable person whose grief had triggered paranoid fantasies about inheritance fraud. Their documentation was comprehensive: sworn statements, recorded phone calls, employment records showing my recent suspension for mental health concerns. Your Honor, the Richardson family has endured months of harassment from Miss Richardson, who's made progressively more extreme accusations against relatives who've shown her nothing but love and support. Reed argued with practiced sincerity. Her hiring of private investigators to stalk family members represents an escalation that threatens public safety. The family's performance was masterful. My parents sat holding hands, projecting the image of devoted spouses concerned about their daughter's welfare. Tiffany dabbed her eyes with tissues, suggesting emotional distress caused by my alleged harassment. Jake maintained professional composure while occasionally shaking his head sadly at Reed's descriptions of my behavior. My court-appointed attorney was clearly overwhelmed by the scope of evidence my family had assembled and the resources they'd deployed. Public defenders handled dozens of cases simultaneously and couldn't match the preparation time that expensive private attorneys invested in strategic prosecution. Your Honor, my attorney attempted, Miss Richardson has no prior criminal record and has been cooperating with the district attorney's office regarding legitimate concerns about elder abuse in her family. Alleged elder abuse, Reed corrected smoothly, based on paranoid accusations from someone whose mental health has deteriorated significantly following her grandmother's death. The DA's office is reviewing Miss Richardson's claims, but my clients have provided substantial evidence that these accusations stem from psychological instability rather than factual criminal activity. The judge appeared skeptical of both sides, but ultimately focused on the immediate question of bail and public safety. Bail is set at $50,000 with conditions that Miss Richardson avoid all contact with complainants and cease any investigation activities related to family members. $50,000. The amount was precisely calculated to be difficult for someone whose employment had been suspended and whose assets were limited. My family had researched my financial situation and requested bail high enough to keep me imprisoned while low enough to avoid appearing vindictive. As I was led back to holding cells to await bail processing, I caught Jake's satisfied smile across the courtroom. They'd successfully transformed me from potential witness against their crimes into criminal defendant, facing prosecution for reporting those crimes. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that humiliation and legal pressure would break my spirit, when actually their escalating attacks were proving everything Helena had warned me about in her letter. From my jail cell, I used my permitted phone call to contact Patricia Stone rather than a bail bondsman. The war has started, I told her simply. Yes, she agreed, and now we fight it with everything Helena gave us. I spent 18 hours in Cook County Jail before Patricia Stone managed to arrange bail through a bondsman who specialized in white-collar crime cases. The experience was deliberately degrading, sharing a cell with women arrested for drug offenses, eating food designed more for cost efficiency than nutrition, and wearing orange clothing that marked me as someone society had deemed unfit for freedom. But the real humiliation began when I walked out of the jail to find television news crews waiting on the front steps. Someone had leaked the story to media outlets, and my arrest had become public entertainment for the evening news cycle. Miss Richardson. A reporter thrust a microphone toward my face as I squinted in the afternoon sunlight. Do you have any comment about the charges filed against you by your own family? I tried to push past the crowd of journalists, but they surrounded me with professional persistence. Cameras captured my disheveled appearance and obvious distress, while reporters shouted questions designed to generate dramatic footage for their broadcasts. Is it true you hired private investigators to stalk your relatives? How do you respond to claims that you've been making false accusations about inheritance fraud? What's your reaction to your family's statement that they're concerned about your mental health? That last question stopped me in my tracks. My family had prepared a statement for the media, which meant their campaign against me was being coordinated with public relations expertise. What statement? I asked the reporter who'd mentioned it. She consulted her notes with satisfaction at having captured my attention. Your brother Jake Richardson released a statement this morning expressing his family's concern about your psychological condition following your grandmother's death. He described your arrest as the culmination of months of increasingly erratic behavior. Patricia Stone appeared at my elbow, gently guiding me toward her car while deflecting media questions with practiced skill. But the damage was already done. My face would be on evening news broadcasts, alongside accusations that painted me as an unstable woman, making wild claims about family members who were simply trying to help me. The drive back to my apartment provided time to process the sophisticated nature of their media strategy. They'd timed my arrest to coincide with news cycles' prepared statements that reinforced their narrative about my mental health and leaked information guaranteed to generate sympathetic coverage for their version of events. How bad is this? I asked Patricia as we sat in her car outside my building. It's exactly what I expected from sophisticated white-collar criminals, she replied honestly. They understand that public opinion can be as important as legal proceedings, so they're trying to control the narrative before our evidence becomes public. My phone had been buzzing continuously with calls from unknown numbers reporters seeking interviews, curious neighbors, and what appeared to be crank callers who'd seen news coverage and decided to share their opinions about family disputes aired in public. One voicemail was from Sarah Chen, a reporter with Chicago Tribune who specialized in investigative journalism. Her message was different from the sensationalist coverage I'd experienced at the Jail Professional, thoughtful and focused on facts rather than spectacle. Miss Richardson, I'm investigating allegations of elder financial abuse in prominent Chicago families. I'd like to discuss your grandmother's case and the charges filed against you. I believe there may be more to this story than initial media coverage suggests. Patricia encouraged me to return Sarah Chen's call, explaining that investigative journalists often provided better protection for whistleblowers than sensationalist news outlets focused on dramatic headlines. Sarah Chen's office occupied a corner of the Tribune building that had clearly seen better days, but her reputation for thorough investigative work had earned respect throughout Chicago's legal and political communities. When we met the following morning, she'd already begun independent research into my family's business activities. Your family's financial situation has improved significantly over the past 5 years. She observed consulting files that suggested extensive background research, property purchases, business investments, lifestyle changes, all coinciding with the period when they had power of attorney responsibilities for your grandmother. How did you discover that so quickly? Public records, property transactions, business filings, most information is available if you know where to look, Sarah explained. What's interesting is the pattern of shell companies your brother established through his law firm. Very sophisticated, very careful, and very profitable. She showed me printouts documenting Jake's business activities that went far beyond what Patricia Stone had uncovered. multiple shell companies, complex financial structures, and client relationships that suggested his law practice was more about money laundering than traditional legal services. "I think your family has been running this scheme with other clients," Sarah continued. "Elderly people with substantial assets and mild cognitive impairment make perfect targets for this kind of systematic theft." The possibility that Helena wasn't their only victim added another dimension to their crimes. These weren't family members who'd made poor decisions about inheritance. They were professional predators who'd developed systematic methods for robbing vulnerable elderly people. "Would you be willing to provide evidence for a comprehensive investigation?" Sarah asked. "I can't guarantee protection from their legal attacks, but I can ensure that their crimes receive thorough public examination." I thought about Helena's letter and her belief that justice delayed wasn't justice denied. "What would you need from me?" "Access to your grandmother's recordings, financial documentation, and detailed information about their intimidation tactics. I want to expose not just their theft, but their systematic destruction of anyone who threatens to hold them accountable." As Sarah Chen began reviewing evidence that same afternoon, my family's media campaign shifted into higher gear. Jake appeared on local television news programs, presenting himself as a concerned brother, trying to help his sister through a psychological crisis while protecting elderly family members from harassment. "Margot has been struggling since our grandmother's death," he said with perfect sincerity during a Channel 7 interview. "We've tried to provide support, but her accusations have become increasingly irrational and aggressive. Filing charges was a last resort to protect our family's safety." The interviewer nodded sympathetically, completely accepting Jake's narrative without questioning the timing or motivations behind their accusations. "What kind of accusations has your sister been making?" "She's hired private investigators to follow us, made wild claims about financial crimes, and threatened to destroy our family's reputation. If we don't give her money, she believes she's entitled to," Jake replied effortlessly, transforming legitimate criminal reporting into evidence of my greed and instability. Watching the broadcast from Patricia Stone's office, I felt the full weight of their public relations expertise. They'd crafted a story that positioned them as victims, while making my legitimate concerns appear to be symptoms of psychological breakdown. Anyone who saw Jake's performance would conclude that I was a disturbed woman, making false accusations against people who were trying to help me. But Sarah Chen had a different perspective when she called that evening. "I found 3 other families with similar stories," she said with excitement that suggested major investigative breakthrough. "Elderly clients of your brother's law firm who died under suspicious circumstances after transferring significant assets to shell companies he controlled. 3 other families. Helena hadn't been an isolated victim, but part of a pattern of elder abuse that Jake had been executing for years while using his legal expertise to avoid detection." "How did you find them so quickly?" "Professional investigators have resources that private citizens don't," Sarah explained. "Once I identified the pattern of shell companies and financial structures, it was relatively simple to trace similar transactions involving other elderly clients." "Are any of those families willing to come forward?" "2 of them are once they understand they're not alone. Your courage in filing charges has given other families permission to speak out about their suspicions." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Helena's plan had been even more sophisticated than I'd understood. She hadn't just been seeking justice for herself, but creating opportunity for other victims to find their voices and hold professional predators accountable for systematic elder abuse. The media war was far from over, but now I had allies who understood that the real story wasn't about a disturbed woman making false accusations. It was about sophisticated criminals who'd spent years perfecting methods for robbing vulnerable elderly people while destroying anyone who threatened to expose them. Tomorrow, Sarah Chen would begin publishing the truth, and my family's carefully constructed narrative was about to collide with evidence they'd never imagined anyone would discover. Sarah Chen's first article appeared in the Chicago Tribune 3 days later with a headline that shattered my family's carefully constructed narrative. Pattern of elder abuse emerges in prominent Chicago law firm investigation. The piece detailed systematic financial exploitation of elderly clients by Jake's practice, complete with documentation, expert analysis, and interviews with multiple victim families. I read the article from Patricia Stone's office, amazed by Sarah's ability to transform complex financial crimes into compelling human stories. She'd managed to interview Margaret Walsh, whose 92-year-old mother had died after transferring her life savings to shell companies controlled by Jake's firm. The Walsh family had suspected theft, but lacked resources to challenge expensive lawyers. "Your grandmother wasn't their first victim," Patricia observed, reading over my shoulder. "Jake has been perfecting these techniques for at least 7 years, targeting elderly clients who trusted him with estate planning." The article included quotes from Dr. Michael Torres, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in elder abuse cases. The Richardson law firm's pattern suggests sophisticated knowledge of cognitive vulnerabilities in elderly populations. They specifically targeted clients with mild dementia or confusion, using legal expertise to exploit trust relationships. But Sarah's investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing than systematic theft evidence: that Jake's law practice was connected to a broader network of professionals who collaborated in elder abuse schemes. "Look at this section." Patricia pointed to a paragraph detailing Jake's professional relationships. "Dr. Richard Hayes, the same psychologist who tried to evaluate you for mental competency, has provided favorable assessments for elderly clients who later transferred assets to Jake's shell companies." Dr. Hayes had been part of their criminal network, using his psychological expertise to manipulate vulnerable elderly people while providing legal cover for their exploitation. The same man who'd tried to declare me mentally incompetent had been collaborating with my family for years. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I'd been avoiding media contacts since Sarah's article published, but something about this caller ID made me answer. "Miss Richardson, this is Detective Amanda Foster with the Financial Crimes Division. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your family's activities and your cooperation with our expanded investigation." Financial Crimes Division. Sarah's article had apparently triggered law enforcement attention beyond the district attorney's office, suggesting that federal agencies were becoming interested in Jake's interstate financial activities. "What kind of expanded investigation?" I asked, gesturing for Patricia to listen in. "Your family's law practice appears to be connected to organized elder abuse spanning multiple states. We've identified similar schemes in Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan involving clients who were transferred between network attorneys before their assets were systematically drained." The scope was staggering. What I'd discovered as crimes against Helena were apparently part of a multi-state criminal enterprise that had been operating for years without detection. Jake hadn't just been stealing from individual clients, he'd been part of a professional network that specialized in elder financial abuse. "We'd like you to testify before a federal grand jury about your grandmother's case and your family's intimidation tactics," Detective Foster continued. "Your cooperation could help us dismantle an entire network of professionals who've been exploiting vulnerable elderly people." Federal grand jury testimony. The stakes had escalated far beyond family disputes about inheritance to federal prosecution of organized criminal activity. My decision to seek justice for Helena had apparently exposed crimes that extended across state lines and involved dozens of victims. After scheduling my meeting with Detective Foster, I called Sarah Chen to thank her for the investigation that had triggered federal attention. "Don't thank me yet," she replied with excitement that suggested major developments. "I've been contacted by former employees of your brother's law firm who want to provide information about internal operations. Tomorrow's article will detail how they systematically identified and targeted elderly clients for exploitation." Former employees willing to testify suggested that Jake's criminal activities were well known within his law practice, possibly involving entire staff in coordinated elder abuse. People who'd participated in or witnessed their crimes were apparently ready to cooperate with investigations in exchange for immunity or reduced charges. "There's something else you should know," Sarah added. "I've been contacted by families in 4 other states with similar stories about network attorneys. Your decision to come forward has created a cascade effect. People who thought they were alone are discovering they're part of a much larger pattern." That evening, as I prepared for bed in my apartment, I reflected on the surreal journey from family humiliation to federal criminal investigation. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a marketing coordinator whose biggest concern was workplace deadlines and student loan payments. Now I was a key witness in a multi-state investigation of organized elder abuse. My phone rang with yet another unknown caller, but this time the voice was familiar and devastating. "Hello, sister." Jake's tone carried none of his usual false warmth, replaced by cold calculation that made my blood freeze. "Congratulations on your media success. You've certainly created quite a stir." "Jake," I said, surprised by my own steadiness, "I assume you're calling to offer another settlement." "Actually, I'm calling to inform you about new evidence that's come to light regarding your mental health history. Evidence that will completely destroy your credibility as a witness." The threat was delivered with surgical precision designed to terrify me about unknown vulnerabilities they discovered or fabricated. "What evidence?" "Psychiatric hospitalizations during college that you've concealed from investigators, medical records documenting your history of depression, anxiety, and paranoid episodes, academic records showing failing grades and erratic behavior patterns." My college years had included normal struggles with adjustment and occasional anxiety, but nothing approaching the serious mental health issues he was describing. They were apparently fabricating medical histories to support their character assassination campaign. "Those records don't exist because those events didn't happen," I replied, though doubt crept into my voice despite my certainty about my own history. "Don't they?" Jake's laugh carried malicious satisfaction. "Medical records can be quite convincing, especially when supported by testimony from concerned family members who witnessed your deteriorating condition. Dr. Hayes has been particularly helpful in documenting your psychological instability." The realization hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just fabricating current mental health concerns, but creating entirely false medical histories to destroy my credibility retroactively. Dr. Hayes' involvement suggested they had professional assistance in manufacturing convincing documentation. "Your federal grand jury testimony will be quite interesting," Jake continued, "when defense attorneys present evidence of your documented psychiatric treatment for delusional thinking and paranoid accusations against family members. Juries tend to be skeptical of witnesses whose medical records indicate chronic mental instability." "That's perjury," I said, grasping for legal concepts that might apply to their fabrication of medical records. "Prove it," Jake challenged coldly. "Medical records are complex, institutional memories are unreliable, and concerned family members have documented your concerning behavior patterns for years. Good luck convincing federal investigators that an entire medical establishment has conspired to frame you." After he disconnected, I sat in my apartment feeling more isolated and vulnerable than ever before. They'd escalated beyond intimidation to active fabrication of evidence designed to destroy my credibility as a federal witness. The sophistication of their criminal defense suggested resources and connections I hadn't fully appreciated. But when I called Patricia Stone to report Jake's threats, her response surprised me with its confidence. "They're getting desperate," she observed. "Fabricating medical records is a federal crime that's relatively easy to detect with proper investigation. They're gambling that intimidation will prevent you from testifying, but they're actually creating additional evidence of obstruction of justice. What if they've convinced medical institutions to support false records? Then they've involved more people in criminal conspiracy, which gives federal investigators additional leverage, for building cases against the entire network. Every lie they tell creates another vulnerability for prosecutors to exploit. Patricia's calm confidence helped restore my perspective about the real balance of power. Helena had given me evidence of their crimes that was supported by their own voices and documented financial transactions. Their desperate fabrication of medical records suggested they understood their legal position was deteriorating rapidly. "Detective Foster wants to meet tomorrow morning," I told Patricia. "Should I be concerned about federal investigators believing their false medical claims?" "Federal agents are trained to detect exactly these kinds of intimidation tactics," Patricia assured me. "Your family's escalating desperation is actually helping prosecutors understand the scope of their criminal activities and the lengths they'll go to avoid accountability." As I tried to sleep that night, I thought about Helena's final words on her recording, her absolute faith that I would seek justice regardless of personal consequences. She'd understood that fighting sophisticated criminals required courage to endure their most vicious attacks. Tomorrow I would meet with federal investigators and provide testimony that could help dismantle an entire network of professionals who'd spent years exploiting vulnerable elderly people. My family's threats and fabricated evidence were proof that Helena's plan was working exactly as she'd intended. They wanted to destroy my credibility. They were about to learn that truth supported by evidence was more powerful than lies supported by intimidation. The FBI field office in downtown Chicago buzzed with activity when I arrived for my federal grand jury preparation meeting. Detective Foster introduced me to Special Agent Karen Rodriguez, whose Financial Crimes Division had been investigating interstate elder abuse networks for over 2 years. "Your family's case has provided the breakthrough we've been seeking," Agent Rodriguez explained as we settled in a secure conference room. "The recordings your grandmother made have given us probable cause for search warrants and financial investigations that were impossible before we had direct evidence of criminal conspiracy." The scope of their investigation was staggering. Multiple task forces coordinating across 6 states, forensic accountants, analyzing complex financial networks and cooperation agreements with families in dozens of elder abuse cases. My decision to seek justice for Helena had apparently triggered the largest elder financial abuse investigation in FBI history. "We executed simultaneous search warrants this morning." Agent Rodriguez continued producing photographs that made my hands shake. "Your family's homes, offices, and financial institutions have all been secured while forensic teams catalog evidence." The photographs showed FBI agents carrying boxes of documents from Jake's law office, computer equipment from my parents' house, and financial records from banks where my family had maintained accounts. The coordinated raids had clearly caught them completely off guard. Jake's office appeared to have been abandoned mid-meeting with legal files scattered across conference tables. "What did you find?" I asked, though the scope of federal involvement suggested they'd discovered evidence far beyond what Patricia Stone and I had uncovered. Agent Rodriguez opened a folder containing preliminary forensic analysis that read like evidence from an organized crime investigation. Over 40 shell companies established by your brother's law firm, financial relationships with network attorneys in 6 states, and systematic money laundering involving approximately $12 million stolen from elderly clients. $12 million. The number was so staggering it felt abstract, representing systematic theft from dozens of vulnerable elderly people across multiple states. Helena's case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for nearly a decade. Your brother's law practice was essentially a front for organized elder abuse. Agent Rodriguez explained, showing me organizational charts that looked like something from a mafia investigation. Network attorneys would refer elderly clients to each other, systematically transferring assets through shell companies while providing legal cover for the theft. The photographs from Jake's office raids included evidence I'd never imagined: detailed client files with psychological profiles of elderly targets, financial analysis identifying the most profitable victims, and coordination schedules with network attorneys in other states. They'd been treating elder abuse like a business, complete with strategic planning and profit optimization. Dr. Hayes was their key psychological consultant. Agent Rodriguez continued producing records that made my stomach churn. He provided cognitive evaluations that supported asset transfers while identifying clients who were most vulnerable to manipulation. Dr. Hayes had been evaluating elderly people not to protect their interests, but to determine how effectively they could be exploited. His psychological expertise was used to maximize theft while minimizing the risk of detection or resistance from victims. The financial analysis shows your family personally benefited from over $2.8 million in stolen assets over the past 5 years. Agent Rodriguez explained, showing me charts that tracked money from Helena's accounts through shell companies to my family's personal expenses. The renovation of my parents' house, Jake's expensive cars, Tiffany's real estate investments, even family vacations, all funded by money stolen from elderly people who'd trusted them with estate management. Every family gathering I'd attended had been celebrating success built on systematic elder abuse. What happens now? I asked, overwhelmed by the scope of evidence federal investigators had assembled in just 3 weeks. Tomorrow morning, we'll arrest your family and approximately 20 other network participants across 6 states. Agent Rodriguez replied with satisfaction that suggested months of preparation. Your cooperation and your grandmother's recordings provided the foundation for dismantling an entire criminal enterprise. The coordinated arrests would involve over 100 federal agents, financial crimes, specialists, and local law enforcement officers. My family would be charged with racketeering money, laundering elder abuse and conspiracy crimes, carrying potential sentences of 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Your testimony will be crucial for securing convictions, Agent Rodriguez emphasized, but we also want you to understand the personal risks. These are sophisticated criminals with substantial resources who will fight these charges aggressively. As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Marcus Reed, Jake's attorney. Agent Rodriguez nodded permission for me to answer on speaker. Miss Richardson, I'm calling to inform you of new legal developments that will significantly impact your situation, Reed announced with his usual professional arrogance. What developments? Federal investigators have apparently been misled by your false accusations into pursuing an investigation based entirely on fabricated evidence and perjured testimony. My clients are prepared to file comprehensive civil rights violations against investigating agencies for harassment based on malicious prosecution. Agent Rodriguez rolled her eyes, clearly familiar with defense tactics designed to intimidate federal witnesses. She gestured for me to continue engaging Reed while FBI technicians traced the call. I see, I replied carefully. And what does that mean for me personally? It means you're facing federal prosecution for providing false information to law enforcement, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government. These are serious felony charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. The threats were delivered with Reed's customary legal precision, designed to terrify me about consequences for cooperating with federal investigations. But Agent Rodriguez was shaking her head with amusement rather than concern. However, Reed continued, my clients remain willing to resolve this matter privately. A complete retraction of your accusations, public apology for making false statements, and agreement to pay damages for harassment could result in our recommendation for reduced federal charges. How much in damages? I asked, curious about their final settlement offer. $500,000 plus public acknowledgement that your accusations were fabricated due to psychological instability following your grandmother's death. $500,000 money I didn't have, demanding public humiliation that would destroy my credibility permanently. It was their final attempt to silence me before federal arrests began. Agent Rodriguez gestured for me to end the call, which I did without responding to Reed's offer. She immediately contacted FBI technical specialists who confirmed they'd successfully traced and recorded the entire conversation. Attempting to intimidate a federal witness is another felony charge. She observed with satisfaction. Your family and their attorney are creating additional evidence of obstruction of justice with every phone call they make. That evening, Patricia Stone joined me for dinner at a restaurant near my apartment, celebrating what she called the beginning of justice for Helena and dozens of other victims. Tomorrow morning will change everything, she said, raising her wine glass in a toast. Your grandmother's plan will finally reach completion. Do you think she knew it would become this big? I asked, still struggling to process the scope of what we'd uncovered. Helena was incredibly intelligent and thorough, Patricia replied thoughtfully. I think she suspected that Jake's crimes extended beyond her case, but she probably didn't imagine the full scope of the criminal network. Her primary goal was protecting you while ensuring justice for herself. As we finished dinner, Sarah Chen called with news that her next article would detail the federal raids and upcoming arrests. This story is going national, she announced excitedly. Network news organizations are requesting interviews, and elder advocacy groups are calling this case a watershed moment for prosecuting systematic elder abuse. National news coverage meant my family's crimes would become public knowledge across the country, destroying their reputations and professional standing permanently. But more importantly, it meant other elderly victims and their families would learn they weren't alone in facing sophisticated criminal networks. Walking back to my apartment that night, I reflected on the journey from family humiliation to federal criminal investigation. 3 weeks ago, I'd felt powerless and isolated, intimidated by people I'd trusted my entire life. Tomorrow, those same people would be arrested by federal agents and charged with crimes carrying decades of imprisonment. Helena had given me more than evidence. She'd given me the tools to seek justice, not just for herself, but for dozens of elderly victims who'd suffered similar exploitation. Her final gift wasn't money or property, but the opportunity to ensure that sophisticated criminals face consequences for their choices. As I prepared for bed, I thought about tomorrow's arrests and the trials that would follow. My family's intimidation campaign had failed, their fabricated evidence had been exposed, and their criminal network was about to be dismantled by federal investigators. They'd spent years perfecting methods for exploiting vulnerable elderly people while destroying anyone who threatened their schemes. Tomorrow they would learn that Helena had prepared one grandchild who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or silenced. Justice for Helena was finally beginning. The news broke at 6 o'clock in the morning with helicopter footage of FBI agents arresting my family in coordinated raids across Chicago. I watched from Patricia Stone's office as Jake was led away in handcuffs from his law firm while my parents were taken from their home in suburban Oak Brook. Tiffany's arrest at her real estate office was particularly dramatic, with agents interrupting a client meeting to place her in federal custody. 23 arrests across 6 states. Agent Rodriguez announced when she called with updates. The entire network has been dismantled simultaneously to prevent destruction of evidence or coordination between defendants. The scope was breathtaking. Network attorneys in Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio had all been arrested on federal racketeering charges, along with psychologists, bank officials, and other professionals who'd facilitated systematic elder abuse. Dr. Hayes had been arrested at his office while attempting to shred patient files that contained evidence of his collaboration with the criminal network. Sarah Chen's article appeared online within hours of the arrests, detailing the investigation and providing background on the sophisticated methods network members had used to exploit elderly clients. Her piece included interviews with victim families who'd suspected theft but lacked resources to challenge expensive lawyers and corrupt professionals. This appears to be the largest elder financial abuse prosecution in federal history. Sarah quoted FBI spokeswoman Director Patricia Coleman. The network's sophisticated methods and interstate coordination required extensive federal resources to investigate and prosecute effectively. By midday, my phone was ringing constantly with interview requests from national news organizations. CNN, Fox News, NBC, and CBS all wanted exclusive interviews with the woman whose courage had exposed systematic elder abuse affecting hundreds of victims. I declined most requests but agreed to speak with 60 Minutes for a comprehensive investigation of elder abuse networks. The arraignment hearings began that afternoon in federal court, where I witnessed my family's first public acknowledgement that their situation had become desperate, beyond their most pessimistic expectations. Jake appeared before Judge Margaret Thompson wearing orange jail clothing instead of his usual expensive suits, while Marcus Reed struggled to present bail arguments for defendants charged with racketeering and money laundering. Your Honor, my client has deep community ties and poses no flight risk. Reed argued with noticeably less confidence than he'd displayed during our previous encounters. Mr. Richardson has maintained a successful law practice in Chicago for over 15 years and has strong family connections that ensure his appearance for trial. Federal prosecutor David Martinez presented a different perspective, with evidence that made my family's situation seem hopeless. Your Honor, Mr. Richardson is the alleged leader of a multi-state criminal enterprise that has stolen over $12 million from elderly victims. His law practice was essentially a front for organized elder abuse, and his extensive financial resources create substantial flight risk. The bail hearing provided my first opportunity to see my family's reaction to federal prosecution. Jake maintained his professional composure, but I could see desperation in his eyes as he realized that federal charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that state charges didn't. My parents appeared completely overwhelmed by proceedings they couldn't control or manipulate through personal connections. Judge Thompson set bail at $2 million for each defendant, amounts designed to ensure their detention while preventing family assets from being used to flee the country. These charges involve sophisticated financial crimes with substantial victim impact, she explained. Defendants will remain in federal custody pending trial preparation. Federal custody meant my family would spend months in jail before their trial began, unable to coordinate their defense or continue their intimidation campaign against witnesses. The federal system provided protections for victims that state courts couldn't match. That evening, I received an unexpected phone call from Cook County Jail, where my family was being held pending transfer to federal facilities. You have a collect call from Susan Richardson. Will you accept charges? My mother's voice carried desperation I'd never heard before, stripped of the controlling confidence that had characterized her throughout my childhood. Margot, sweetheart, we need to talk. There's been a terrible misunderstanding about family business, and we need your help to straighten things out. What kind of help? I asked, curious about what they could possibly offer from jail. The federal investigators have been misled about legitimate business transactions. Your father and Jake were simply helping Helena manage complex estate matters, not stealing from her. We need you to clarify the misunderstanding before this gets completely out of hand. The attempt to reframe systematic theft as legitimate business transactions was breathtaking in its audacity. Even facing federal racketeering charges, they were still trying to manipulate my perception of reality. Mom, I heard the recordings. I heard Jake discussing shell companies and money laundering. I heard you talking about manipulating Helena while she was medicated. Those recordings were taken out of context. She insisted, though her voice betrayed uncertainty about what evidence federal investigators actually possessed. Helena was confused and recording random conversations without understanding what she was hearing. What about the bank records, the forged documents, the shell companies that stole over $2 million? My mother's silence stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had been disconnected. Finally, she spoke with the desperate tone of someone who'd run out of plausible explanations. We need you to testify that Helena was mentally incompetent and that her recordings were fabricated by people trying to manipulate a confused elderly woman. Marcus Reed says your testimony could prevent convictions on the most serious charges. The request was stunning in its implications. They wanted me to commit perjury before a federal grand jury to help them avoid accountability for crimes I'd personally witnessed and documented. Their desperation had apparently overcome any remaining concern for my welfare or legal safety. You want me to lie to federal investigators? We want you to tell the truth about Helena's mental condition and the family's legitimate business activities. My mother replied using language that sounded coached by attorneys. You're the only family member who wasn't involved in estate management, which makes your testimony particularly credible. The irony was perfect. My distance from their crimes, which Helena had identified as my protection, was now what made me valuable as a potential defense witness willing to commit perjury on their behalf. What if I refuse? I asked, though I'd already decided. Then you'll be responsible for destroying your entire family based on misunderstandings and fabricated evidence. Jake could face 30 years in federal prison, Margot. Your father and I could die in jail. Is that really what you want? The emotional manipulation was precisely calibrated to exploit my love for family members who'd betrayed everything they'd claimed to represent. They were gambling that blood relationships would override evidence of systematic criminal behavior. I need to think about it, I said, ending the call before my mother could continue her persuasion attempts. But I'd already made my decision during the first week after Helena's death. I would seek justice for her and for dozens of other elderly victims regardless of personal consequences or family pressure. Their desperate attempts to recruit me for perjury only confirmed that federal prosecutors had assembled evidence sufficient for convictions. Patricia Stone had predicted this moment when sophisticated criminals realized their situation was hopeless and attempted to involve additional people in their crimes. Their request for perjured testimony was actually evidence of obstruction of justice that federal prosecutors could use to strengthen their case. Tomorrow I would testify before the federal grand jury and provide evidence that would help ensure convictions for systematic elder abuse. My family's desperation was proof that Helena's plan had succeeded beyond her most optimistic expectations. They'd spent years exploiting vulnerable elderly people while destroying anyone who threatened their schemes. Now they would face consequences in a federal system designed to hold sophisticated criminals accountable for their choices. Justice for Helena was no longer a hope, it was a certainty. The federal grand jury testimony took place in a secure courthouse facility designed specifically for high-profile organized crime cases. I spent 3 hours providing detailed evidence about Helena's investigation, my family's crimes, and their systematic intimidation campaign designed to prevent prosecution. The grand jurors asked thoughtful questions that demonstrated their understanding of the sophisticated methods my family had used to exploit elderly victims. The evidence is overwhelming, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen assured me after the session. Your family's own voices on your grandmother's recordings provide irrefutable proof of criminal conspiracy, while their intimidation tactics have created additional obstruction of justice charges. Federal prosecution differed dramatically from state criminal proceedings I'd witnessed. The resources, expertise, and coordination available to federal investigators made my family's previous legal maneuvering seem amateurish by comparison. They were facing prosecutors who specialized in complex financial crimes and had unlimited resources for building comprehensive cases. But my family's desperation was about to escalate beyond anything I'd experienced before. That afternoon, Marcus Reed held a press conference outside the federal courthouse, flanked by Dr. Hayes and 2 people I didn't recognize. His announcement would represent their final attempt to destroy my credibility before the full scope of federal evidence became public. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to expose a massive fraud perpetrated against the federal justice system by an unstable woman seeking to inherit money she's not entitled to, Reed announced with practiced authority. Miss Margot Richardson has fabricated evidence, perjured herself before federal investigators, and manipulated a confused elderly woman into creating false documentation to support inheritance fraud. The press conference was being broadcast live on local television, suggesting they'd coordinated with media outlets sympathetic to their version of events. Reid's presentation included charts, documents, and testimony from people presented as credible professionals. Dr. Hayes will demonstrate that Miss Richardson has a documented history of psychological instability, paranoid delusions, and aggressive behavior toward family members who tried to provide appropriate mental health support. Dr. Hayes stepped forward with medical-looking files that appeared convincing to journalists unfamiliar with the federal investigation. Miss Richardson has exhibited classic symptoms of persecution, complex, exacerbated by grief reactions to her grandmother's death. Her allegations against family members represent projection of her own guilt about neglecting an elderly relative during her final illness. The psychological diagnosis was delivered with professional authority that made it sound legitimate despite being completely fabricated. Hayes was using his credentials to provide false expert testimony designed to discredit my federal grand jury statements. Additionally, Reid continued, we have testimony from Miss Richardson's former supervisors and colleagues documenting erratic workplace behavior, paranoid accusations against co-workers, and concerning statements about conspiracy theories involving her family's legitimate business activities. Two people I'd never seen before stepped forward, introducing themselves as former colleagues from Creative Solutions Marketing. Their statements described behavior that bore no resemblance to my actual workplace performance, suggesting they'd been paid to provide false testimony about my professional conduct. Miss Richardson threatened to destroy her family's reputation and financial security if they didn't provide her with money she claimed to deserve from her grandmother's estate. One fake colleague testified. She spoke obsessively about inheritance fraud and expressed anger that her relatives had been more successful than she was. The fabricated testimony was sophisticated enough to sound plausible to anyone unfamiliar with the actual facts. They'd created an alternative narrative that transformed systematic elder abuse into family members protecting themselves from an unstable relative making false accusations for financial gain. Reid's press conference concluded with a direct challenge to federal prosecutors. We call upon the U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate Miss Richardson for perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government. Her false allegations have wasted taxpayer resources while traumatizing elderly family members who simply tried to help her. I watched the broadcast from Agent Rodriguez's office, amazed by their willingness to fabricate testimony on live television while facing federal criminal charges. Aren't they making their situation worse by lying publicly about a federal investigation? I asked. Agent Rodriguez smiled with satisfaction that suggested federal prosecutors had anticipated this desperate move. Actually, they're creating additional evidence of obstruction of justice, while demonstrating exactly the kind of sophisticated deception your grandmother warned you about. What do you mean? Every false statement they make during that press conference becomes evidence of ongoing criminal behavior. Dr. Hayes is committing perjury on live television, while Reid is suborning additional false testimony from paid witnesses. The press conference was apparently being recorded by federal investigators as evidence of continuing criminal conspiracy. My family's attempt to discredit me was actually providing prosecutors with real-time documentation of their willingness to fabricate evidence and manipulate public opinion. There's something else you should know, Agent Rodriguez added, producing a folder that made my heart race with anticipation. We've discovered additional recordings your grandmother made that even she didn't know about. What kind of recordings? Helena's tablet automatically backed up voice memos to cloud storage, including recordings she made during the final weeks of her life. She was essentially keeping a detailed audio diary of your family's treatment during her illness. Agent Rodriguez activated her computer and played audio that brought tears to my eyes immediately. Helena's voice, weakened by illness, but absolutely clear in its reasoning, described my family's behavior during her final hospitalization. March 15th. Helena's voice began, "Susan visited again today with more papers to sign. She waited until the nurse left, then told me that if I didn't cooperate with their financial arrangements, they'd move me to a state facility where I wouldn't receive proper care. When I asked to read the documents, she said my confusion made detailed review unnecessary." The recording captured systematic threats and emotional abuse that went beyond financial theft to deliberate cruelty toward a dying woman. My mother's voice was audible in the background, using intimidation tactics to force Helena's compliance with document signing. March 20th. Helena continued in another recording. "Jake visited with his wife today. They discussed selling my house and hotel properties as soon as the death certificate is processed. Tiffany said my sentimental attachment to affordable housing was preventing maximum profit extraction from development opportunities." The recordings provided evidence that my family had been planning to liquidate Helena's assets before her death, treating her life as an inconvenient obstacle to accessing her wealth. They'd been discussing profit maximization while she lay dying in a hospital bed. The final recording was made 2 days before Helena's death. Agent Rodriguez explained, and it contains information that fundamentally changes our understanding of her final moments. Helena's voice was barely audible, but her words were clear and devastating. "I know they're planning to increase my pain medication to accelerate my death. I heard Susan talking to Jake about speeding up the timeline so inheritance processing could begin before anyone questioned their activities. They're not just stealing my money, they're trying to kill me." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. My family hadn't just stolen Helena's money, they'd potentially hastened her death to prevent discovery of their crimes and accelerate access to her inheritance. "Are you suggesting they murdered her?" I whispered, afraid to voice the possibility aloud. "We're investigating that possibility," Agent Rodriguez replied grimly. "Helena's medical records show pain medication levels that exceeded prescribed dosages during her final week, and hospital staff noted unusual family interest in medication schedules." Murder. The word transformed everything I thought I understood about my family's crimes. They weren't just sophisticated thieves, they were potentially people who'd killed an elderly woman to steal her money and prevent discovery of their systematic elder abuse. The medical examiner is conducting additional analysis of Helena's tissue samples, Agent Rodriguez explained. But the recordings provide clear evidence of intent and opportunity for what could constitute first-degree murder charges. As I absorbed the possibility that my family had murdered Helena, I felt something shift inside me that went beyond anger or grief to absolute determination that they would face consequences for every crime they'd committed. Helena hadn't just given me evidence of theft, she'd potentially documented her own murder, while providing tools for her killers to be held accountable. Her final gift was ensuring that justice would be comprehensive and inescapable. They'd spent years exploiting vulnerable elderly people while destroying anyone who threatened their schemes. Now they would face prosecution for murder, racketeering, elder abuse, and every other crime they'd committed in their pursuit of wealth. Justice for Helena was no longer about money or inheritance. It was about ensuring that sophisticated killers faced the death penalty they'd inflicted on others. The murder charges were filed 6 weeks later, after forensic analysis confirmed that Helena had been systematically poisoned with pain medication doses that gradually increased beyond therapeutic levels. Dr. Catherine Murphy, the forensic pathologist who conducted the analysis, testified that Helena's death wasn't natural, but resulted from deliberate medication overdoses administered over several days. The tissue samples show concentration levels consistent with intentional poisoning rather than medical error or accidental overdose, Dr. Murphy explained during the preliminary hearing. Someone with access to Mrs. Richardson's medication systematically increased dosages while monitoring her declining condition. My family faced federal murder charges in addition to racketeering, elder abuse, and money laundering. The death penalty was a possibility for Jake, who prosecutors identified as the criminal enterprise's leader, while my parents and Tiffany faced life imprisonment without parole. The trial began 8 months later in federal court before Judge Patricia Coleman, who specialized in organized crime cases. Media coverage was extensive, with Court TV providing daily broadcast updates about what newspapers called the largest elder abuse prosecution in American history. I testified for 3 days about Helena's investigation, my family's crimes, and their systematic intimidation campaign. The recordings Helena had made were played in their entirety, allowing the jury to hear my family's own words as they planned theft, discussed murder, and celebrated their manipulation of a dying woman. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Federal Prosecutor Maria Santos said during opening arguments, "You will hear the defendants in their own voices plotting to steal from, intimidate, and ultimately murder an elderly woman who trusted them with her life and financial security." The prosecution's case was comprehensive and devastating. FBI forensic accountants detailed the $12 million stolen across 6 states, while medical experts explained how Helena had been systematically poisoned during her final weeks. Former network attorneys testified about the sophisticated methods used to target and exploit elderly victims. My family's defense strategy focused on discrediting my testimony and portraying Helena as a confused elderly woman whose recordings captured misunderstood conversations. Marcus Reed argued that grief had caused me to misinterpret normal family financial discussions as evidence of criminal conspiracy. Ms. Richardson's tragic misunderstanding of legitimate estate management has resulted in false accusations against family members who devoted their lives to caring for an elderly relative with declining cognitive function, Reed told the jury during his opening statement. But the evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Helena's recordings captured my family's voices planning crimes in explicit detail, while forensic evidence proved systematic theft and murder. Dr. Hayes testified against his former collaborators in exchange for a plea agreement providing insider details about network operations. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Jake was convicted of leading a criminal enterprise, first-degree murder, racketeering, and money laundering. My parents were convicted of elder abuse, murder, conspiracy, and theft. Tiffany was convicted of money laundering and conspiracy charges. Judge Coleman's sentencing hearing took place 2 months later, providing victim families their first opportunity to address the defendants directly about the impact of their crimes. Margaret Walsh spoke about her mother's confusion and fear during her final months as Jake's network systematically drained her life savings. "My mother died believing she was a burden on her family because she couldn't understand why her money was disappearing. Your greed stole not just her savings, but her dignity and peace of mind." 12 other victim families provided similar testimony about elderly relatives who died in poverty and confusion after network attorneys stole their assets through sophisticated legal manipulation. The cumulative impact was devastating, demonstrating that Helena's case was part of systematic predation targeting vulnerable elderly people across multiple states. When Judge Coleman asked if I wanted to address the defendants, I stood and looked directly at my family for the first time since Helena's death. "You spent years stealing from an elderly woman who loved and trusted you," I said, my voice carrying strength I'd never known I possessed. "You isolated her from friends, manipulated her confusion, and ultimately murdered her to prevent discovery of your crimes. But Helena was smarter than you realized, and she ensured that justice would be served regardless of your intimidation tactics." Jake received life imprisonment without parole for murder and racketeering. My parents received 25 years each for elder abuse and conspiracy. Tiffany received 15 years for money laundering. Dr. Hayes and other network collaborators received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years, depending on their level of involvement. The criminal asset forfeiture proceedings recovered over $8 million from my family's account shell companies and property purchases. Helena's estate was restored to its proper value, while victim families received compensation from seized criminal assets. But the real justice was seeing sophisticated criminals who'd spent years exploiting vulnerable elderly people, finally held accountable for their choices. They'd believed their legal expertise and professional connections made them untouchable. But Helena had given me tools powerful enough to ensure their prosecution and conviction. "Your grandmother would be proud," Patricia Stone told me after the sentencing hearing. "She knew this day would come, and she prepared you to see it through, regardless of personal cost." Sarah Chen's book about the case became a bestseller that raised national awareness about elder financial abuse and led to federal legislation strengthening protections for vulnerable elderly people. The Helena Richardson Elder Protection Act created national databases for tracking suspicious financial activities and required mandatory reporting of potential elder abuse by legal and medical professionals. 6 months after the trial concluded, I stood in Helena's garden shed one final time before selling the property. The wooden chest where she'd hidden my childhood treasures now contained thank you letters from elderly people and their families who'd been protected by the new legislation inspired by her courage. Helena had given me more than an inheritance. She'd given me the opportunity to transform personal tragedy into protection for others facing similar exploitation. Her final gift was proof that one person's courage could create change that protected countless future victims. As I locked the shed for the last time, I felt her presence, like a gentle touch on my shoulder. She'd kept her promise to ensure justice was served, while teaching me that true strength meant protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. The naive woman who'd walked into that law office for Helena's will reading was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love sometimes requires holding people accountable for their actions, regardless of family relationships or personal cost. Helena's legacy lived on in every elderly person, protected by legislation bearing her name, and in every family that would never experience the betrayal and exploitation that had defined her final years. Justice for Helena was complete, but her protection of others would continue forever. 18 months after my family's conviction, I stood in the lobby of the Helena Richardson Center for Elder Protection, watching our team of investigators, social workers, and legal advocates help another family whose elderly father had been targeted by financial predators. Our Chicago facility, operated out of one of Helena's former hotels, transformed into a comprehensive resource center for elder abuse victims and their families. The center provided free legal representation for elderly victims of financial abuse, investigative services to uncover complex fraud schemes, and support groups for families dealing with the trauma of betrayal by trusted relatives or professionals. We'd helped over 300 families in our first year, preventing millions of dollars in theft while holding dozens of criminals accountable for their actions. Patricia Stone served as our Director of Investigations, using her expertise to train a new generation of professionals who specialized in elder financial crimes. Her team included former FBI agents, forensic accountants, and social workers who understood the sophisticated methods predators used to exploit vulnerable elderly people. The Richardson case created a blueprint for investigating organized elder abuse. Patricia explained to visiting law enforcement officials during their tour of our facilities. Helena's recordings demonstrated the importance of documentation, while Margot's courage showed that victims' families can successfully challenge even the most sophisticated criminal networks. Sarah Chen had become our communications director, using her investigative journalism background to raise public awareness about elder abuse, while educating families about warning signs of financial exploitation. Her work with national media outlets had helped establish elder protection as a priority issue for federal law enforcement agencies. Every month, we receive calls from families who recognize patterns they've seen in media coverage of the Richardson case, Sarah told the visiting officials. Helena's story gave people permission to trust their instincts when something seemed wrong with their elderly relatives' financial situations. The Helena Richardson Foundation had distributed over $5 million in grants to elder protection organizations across the country, funding research into prevention methods while supporting legal advocacy for vulnerable populations. We'd established satellite offices in 6 states, partnering with local organizations to create comprehensive networks of protection and support. But our most important work involved individual families like the Johnsons, whose 78-year-old father had been targeted by a network similar to Jake's operation. Mrs. Johnson sat in our conference room with tears streaming down her face as she described watching her father's confusion and fear during his final months. Dad kept saying that money was disappearing from his accounts, but his lawyer told us it was normal confusion from his dementia. She explained, "We believed the professional instead of trusting our father's concerns." Our investigation had uncovered systematic theft by the father's attorney who'd been transferring assets to shell companies while convincing family members that their father's complaints were symptoms of cognitive decline. The pattern was identical to Helena's case exploitation of trust relationships, combined with manipulation of family members who wanted to believe their elderly relative was receiving professional care. "Your father was right to be concerned," I told Mrs. Johnson gently. "Elderly people often retain financial awareness even when other cognitive functions decline. His complaints weren't confusion, they were accurate reporting of crimes being committed against him." Working with elder abuse victims had taught me that Helena's experience wasn't unique. Thousands of elderly people face similar exploitation by family members, legal professionals, and medical providers who viewed cognitive decline as business opportunity rather than tragedy requiring protection and support. The center's support groups provided space for families to process the trauma of discovering that trusted relatives or professionals had been systematically stealing from vulnerable elderly people. The betrayal often created damage that extended far beyond financial loss to fundamental questions about trust, family loyalty, and the safety of aging in America. "The hardest part isn't the money," explained Robert Martinez, whose mother had lost her life savings to a nephew who'd convinced her to invest in fraudulent schemes. "It's knowing that someone she loved and trusted was planning to rob her while pretending to care about her welfare." I understood his pain completely. My journey from family humiliation to elder advocacy had taught me that money could be recovered, but trust destroyed by systematic betrayal created wounds that never completely healed. The center's counseling services helped families rebuild their capacity for healthy relationships while processing the trauma of discovering criminal behavior by people they'd loved. The legislative impact of Helena's case continued expanding as more states adopted comprehensive elder protection laws modeled on federal standards we'd helped develop. The Helena Richardson Elder Protection Act had become the foundation for systematic reform of how legal, medical, and financial institutions handled elderly clients with cognitive vulnerabilities. Your grandmother's courage has protected thousands of elderly people who will never know her name, Patricia told me during our annual memorial service in Helena's honor. Her decision to document criminal behavior and trust you with justice created ripple effects that continue expanding every day. The memorial service was held in Helena's garden, now maintained as part of the center's educational programs. Families who'd been helped by our organization gathered to honor the woman whose final months of systematic abuse had created comprehensive protection for others facing similar exploitation. But the most meaningful part of my work involved direct interaction with elderly people who contacted our hotline when they suspected financial abuse. Their voices reminded me of Helena's quiet dignity and determination to ensure that other people wouldn't suffer the betrayal and exploitation she'd experienced. "I think my daughter is stealing from my checking account," an 84-year-old woman told me during a recent call. "But she says I'm confused and that my memory problems make me imagine things that aren't happening." Her situation was heartbreakingly familiar. Family members using cognitive decline to dismiss legitimate concerns about financial irregularities while systematically draining accounts they were supposed to protect. The center's investigation team had developed sophisticated methods for documenting elder abuse while preserving elderly victims' dignity and autonomy. "You're not confused," I assured her. "Your concerns deserve investigation, and we have people who can help you understand what's happening with your accounts." Every successful case reinforced my understanding of Helena's final gift. She'd given me more than evidence of my family's crimes. She'd given me purpose that transformed personal tragedy into protection for countless other vulnerable people. The center had become my life's work, but it was also therapy for the trauma of discovering that my entire family were criminals who'd murdered the woman who'd loved and protected me throughout my childhood. Helping other families navigate similar betrayals provided meaning that made my own losses bearable. As I concluded another day at the center, I often walked through Helena's memorial garden and felt her presence like encouragement to continue fighting for people who couldn't protect themselves. Her legacy lived in every elderly person who maintained financial security because our advocates had detected predatory behavior before serious damage occurred. The naive marketing coordinator who'd walked into that law office 18 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true strength meant using privilege and resources to protect others from the exploitation she'd witnessed firsthand. Helena had prepared me for this work without either of us understanding the full scope of what would be required. But she'd been right about one crucial thing. Justice delayed wasn't justice denied when someone had the courage to fight for it, regardless of personal cost. Her faith in my integrity had created protection for thousands of elderly people who would live with dignity and security because one woman had refused to let systematic abuse continue unchallenged. I often wondered what Helena would think about the center that bore her name and the legislation that honored her memory. I believe she'd be proud that her suffering had created meaningful protection for others, but she'd probably be most satisfied knowing that sophisticated criminals could no longer exploit vulnerable elderly people without facing consequences. Her final words on the recordings echoed in my memory during difficult days. "Margot will discover the truth because she's the only family member with integrity. And when she does, you'll finally face consequences for treating an elderly woman like a bank account you're entitled to drain." She'd been right about everything: my integrity, my determination, and the justice that would eventually be served. But her greatest gift was teaching me that love sometimes requires holding people accountable for their actions, even when those people share your DNA and claim to represent family values. Standing in Helena's garden as twilight settled over Chicago, I felt grateful for the opportunity to transform personal tragedy into protection for others. Her courage had created ripple effects that would continue expanding long after everyone involved in the original case had been forgotten. The Helena Richardson Center for Elder Protection would ensure that her legacy lived forever in every elderly person who maintained dignity, security, and autonomy because someone cared enough to fight for their protection. Have you ever wondered if an elderly relative's concerns about money might be more than confusion? Sometimes trusting their instincts can prevent tragedy and hold criminals accountable for exploitation of our most vulnerable citizens. If this story resonated with you, please share it with others who might benefit from understanding that elder abuse can be challenged successfully when families have courage to seek justice. Like this video to help spread awareness about protecting our elderly loved ones. Subscribe for more stories about people who found strength to fight injustice, and comment below about your own experiences with family courage in difficult situations. Thank you for joining Helena's fight for elder protection. Together, we can ensure that love and integrity triumph over greed and exploitation.